You're gonna, okay.
Well, Vaughan, you may as well start now.
Go ahead and start, you say?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, uh, thank you for having me at your group up there. I hope y'all aren't freezing too much. Down in Alabama, we're getting some bad weather, but it's still rather warm at 50 degrees. This is where we meet, and we meet at a church called People of Mars Hill. And I have a Facebook group that you can follow from there as well. My email is in the top right, as you can see. As far as my background, I have an undergraduate degree in biology from Florida State and a degree in medicine from UAB and board certified in family practice. And however, I've been retired for 7 years now. Um, During that time, I was the medical research scientist for about 15 years of that. And this is one of the studies that I published with the help of others in the bottom right. It hit me that the playoff game was getting ready to start, and then I realized that this is the Stanley Cup. You guys really don't care too much. But originally, I was going to make this a 90-minute lecture, but when I found out the playoff is going to be there, it's going to be a 30-minute lecture with 20 minutes for questions. Anyway, the subject of my talk is going to be that science confirms the Bible, especially with regard to mitochondrial Eve and Y-chromosome Adam. And I'll explain those terms in a little bit. On the right-hand side, there's a picture of a mitochondria inside a cell. It's the energy-producing organelle of the cell, and they can study the DNA of this to make associations between different species and during times to see the relatedness of different individuals. At the same time, this subject really scientifically confirms Noah's flood. We've never really had any scientific evidence for it, but while we're studying the mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam, we come across other studies that actually put this event as a scientific fact. It's rather remarkable. As a disclaimer, these views are uniquely my own, based on my interpretations of actual studies with a healthy dose of imagination. While they closely follow RTB's things, there are a few things that they have not talked about, which I have proposed in my presentation. Y-chromosomal Adam and mitochondrial Eve are terms used in population genetics to refer to the most recent common ancestors of all living humans, patrilineally and matrilineally, respectively. The existence of Y chromosome Adam and mitochondrial Eve was first proposed in the 1980s, and their estimated ages have been refined over time. This was the first article that came up with the concept of mitochondrial Eve, and it's in Nature Journal. By the way, if you took all the articles that everyone read for a given year, 50% of them would be Nature Journal. They are the cream of the crop, and everyone goes to them for their knowledge for the most part. This study was published in 1987, and it was a bombshell. And it basically said that mitochondrial DNA, it's about mitochondrial DNA and human evolution. It goes on to say that mitochondrial DNAs from 147 people drawn from 5 geographical populations have been analyzed by restriction mapping. Restriction mapping means we can take DNA from the mitochondrial, which is about 1,600 base pairs, and they can
lose them? Hello, are you there? I can't hear you anymore.
As you can imagine, this was, an amazing finding. However, scientists didn't want to really believe there was such an Eve, and they pushed back by saying that if there was an Eve, she was just a lucky survivor of a population of 100,000. They call that the lucky Eve hypothesis. It doesn't have any um, um, real validity, which this another study will show soon. So after mitochondrial Eve was established in the journal Nature published another article.
Vaughn,
Over.
Vaughn, we're having a problem with the sound here. Or
Is that am I the problem?
I don't know, or you're cutting out every few minutes now and then coming back.
Maybe his voice operated switch on his mic. He's using
I've just got a simple laptop. It's never given me troubles before. Should I disconnect and reconnect?
But just turn your mute on and turn it off.
My mute, which, okay, has that made a difference?
Well, I can hear you now. Why don't you just go ahead? We'll see what happens.
I'm increasing the volume. How about that?
Maybe.
Okay, just jump in there and say something.
All right.
Okay, so this Y chromosome study was really confined to China, but as you can imagine, China is 1/4 of the Earth's population, and they concluded that there was one founding Y chromosome man. So by just extension, it really applied to the whole world. And this was done in 2000. Measuring the genetic diversity of the Y chromosome variations, accumulated mutations at a relatively constant rate provides a molecular clock for estimating the divergent times between the populations. What they're saying is that Y chromosomes, they're smaller and their mutation rates are reduced. And they're really at a relatively constant rate. So they can infer basically when different Y chromosomes are because of that. They can compare the mutations. This means that all living men can trace their Y chromosome back to a single man, Y chromosome Adam, and all living women can trace their mitochondrial DNA back to a single woman, mitochondrial Eve. Now, it's important to know that all mankind goes back to the mitochondrial Eve, but only men go back to Y Adam because only Adam had a Y chromosome. And we all inherit mitochondria from Eve. This is just a picture of a Y chromosome, and it's called Y because it looks like a Y, and it's much smaller than the other chromosomes. Mitochondrial DNA barcodes are used for ancestral tracing. I'll explain barcodes in a second, due to several reasons. Maternal inheritance. Mitochondrial Eve is exclusively passed down from mothers to their offspring, making it a direct link to the past. In this diagram, you can see that from the women past their mitochondrial on the far left down to the next generation. And that's where the mitochondrial DNA comes from. Whereas for men, they pass their Y chromosome down to the nucleus, and that's not their Y chromosome. Sperm has a few mitochondria, but they are not passed between males and their progenitors. Anyway, back to the Y chromosome, the small size and conserved structure of mitochondrial DNA is a relatively small and well-conserved molecule. Remember, it's about 1,600 base pairs, making it easier to amplify and sequence compared to the nuclear DNA. The mitochondria has 1,600 base pairs, but the nuclear DNA has 2.3 billion base pairs. So trying to compare those two would be quite difficult. Also, there's an abundance in our cells. They have several mitochondria, and the mitochondria is in multiple copies per cell. So it makes it more readily detectable than nuclear DNA. As of 2016, there are close to 5 billion COI barcodes, and I'll explain that in the next slide. Well, it's basically cytooxygenase inhibitor enzymes, which are in the mitochondria, between the GenBank and BOLD databases. So those are two large databases that have been saving up this stuff. In the last 20 years, we've had a plethora of DNA analysis because computers have gotten cheaper and we're able to now sequence whole genes, genomes of individuals. And so we're just getting a ton of DNA sequenced. So we can now compare 5 million copies of different mitochondria going across hundreds of thousands of different animals. So objections can now be seen in the cumulative light of these data and much more than a decade's experience. There's no longer any doubt that DNA barcodes are useful and practical. In the early days of this, there was a lot of possible objections because you didn't have this large amount of data. Now that we have 5 million barcodes, it's really hard to make any objections to it. This is basically, this is the mitochondria in the cell. You can see it in the top left, it's a typical animal cell, and then below is the mitochondria in it, and then a breakdown of the mitochondrial genome in the bottom right. And you see the letter COXI. Well, that's the COI barcode. It's in green, and it makes up about 900 base pairs, and it's a cyclooxygenase enzyme. And so when they study a mitochondria, they're actually studying that barcode of 900 base pairs, and it doesn't mutate very much, and it maintains itself, so you can compare it over age and time. So at first, in that first article that you saw about mitochondrial Eve, they were dating Eve to be around 200,000 years ago. And then the Y-chromosome Adam studies were showing him to be about 70,000 years ago. Well, many scientists laughed about this, but the last laugh was on them, basically. Here's an example article that there's many of these coming out from the BBC. Genetic Adam and Eve, genetic Adam never met Eve. And there was countless articles like this. And but then this article came out just 10 years ago, also in Nature, the most reputable journal out there. Genetic Adam and Eve did not live too far apart in time. I mean, this was another nuclear bomb. They didn't like the idea of mitochondrial Eve to begin with. They didn't like Y chromosome Adam and its implications. They tried to say they were too far apart. And then this article comes along and explains that two large studies showed that they lived about the same time. In their article, they say the book of Genesis puts Adam and Eve together in the Garden of Eden. When scientists quote the book of Genesis or the Bible, the rest of the scientists can't stand it. And hear these guys saying Adam and Eve lived together in the garden. But geneticists' version of the duo, the ancestors to whom the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA of today's humans can be traced, were thought to have lived tens of thousands of years apart. This is what I was saying earlier. Now, two major studies of modern humans, two major studies, show that Y chromosomes suggest that Y chromosome Adam and mitochondrial Eve may have lived around the same time after all. They throw in the after all. So, this pretty much is another game changer. It's just driving the scientists crazy. I throw in this slide just kind of as an interest to me. On the far right, you see Adam and Eve being pushed out of the garden after their sin. And you see a cherubim angel standing there, and he's got a sword that's supposed to be able to turn in all four directions. And it was not just one cherubim, but it was many cherubim. And I've often wondered, why would God need a cherubim to make them stay away from the tree of life? Why not just a regular angel? Well, I believe that since a cherubim is probably one of the most powerful angels there is, vis-a-vis Lucifer, I'm guessing a cherubim was put in there to make sure that Lucifer didn't try to reintroduce them to the tree of life. Can you imagine Adam and Eve continuing to live in a state of sin indefinitely? How many dystopic science fiction movies have you seen where people were able to live forever and they got more and more evil as they lived longer and longer? So on the left, it says he drove out man out of the east of the garden and he stationed cherubim and a flaming sword, which turned in every direction to guard the way to the tree of life. I mean, that thing must have been like basically a lightsaber on steroids. I mean, you know, so, but anyway, that's a fascinating story. But also, what's interesting about this story, and I'll address in the next passage, is why didn't God want them to live indefinitely? And what physical attributes did that tree have to make them live indefinitely? How did it work on their genetics, in other words? If you look at the on the left-hand side, you see the ages of the antediluvian civilization. Starting off with Adam, he lived 930 years. And if you go down to Noah, he actually lived another 20 years at 950 years. So they all lived about 900 plus years in general. But after the flood, starting with Noah and going down, it's almost an exact curve as the age in life goes down drastically, headed towards about 120 years of age. So something was different before the flood, and something was different after the flood. And I believe that I might have, I believe this has something to do with what's called epigenetics. Epigenetics is a new field of science which has actually disproven neo-Darwinism in a big way. The reason is epigenetics says that genes are turned on and turned off by tags that are put on top of the DNA. Whereas for neo-Darwinism, a change to occur in the organism and cause evolution, you have a mutation which causes that change in natural selection. Epigenetics doesn't need natural selection. It doesn't need mutations. It works outside of them. And yet it's explaining many things. This is PubMed. And if you look up the word epigenetics aging, there's almost 9,000 articles that's been written almost in just the last 5 years about this subject. Talking with a colleague, it's possible that we might be living to 140 years of age in the next 10 years. And that's not an overestimation. They've already done experiments to make animals live longer based upon different combinations of medications and affecting their epigenes. This is a crude diagram discussing it. When you're born, when you're formed as an embryo, your epigenetics are stripped off the DNA and you start off anew. And then during life, you see the little red tags there? Those are epigenes that are getting placed in the wrong place. They call that epigenetic drift. And the more epigenetic drift, the more it turns off genes errantly aging. So this is a current model by which things are measured. And they can do blood tests on us today to actually figure out what your chronological age is based on the epigenetic profile. But if you consider the population bottleneck that occurred at Noah's, if you consider the population bottleneck that occurred at Noah's flood, there'd be a drastic reduction in the population. It can have detrimental effects on loss of beneficial alleles, increased homozygosity, which means the genes are the same on both chromosomes, which means recessive traits can pop out, epigenetic drift, which I showed you a diagram of, and transgenerational. Relate between genetic diversity and epigenetic complexity. And as we lost genetic diversity, the epigenetic complexity would also be affected. So bottlenecks can lead to a loss of genetic variance, potentially exceeding the tolerable ranges for maintaining epigenetic complexity. This could disrupt critical epigenetic patterns involving aging. So it's possible that the tree of life was actually healing Adam and Eve indefinitely I mean, they may have been in the garden for 10,000 years, but and eating the tree of life was making them go longer and longer. But once they couldn't eat that tree of life, their ages became the same as the other antediluvians. So, so subsequently, after the flood, bottleneck, um, epigenetic drift would occur and aging would start to increase. Pre-existing epigenetic complexity, organisms with inherently higher epigenetic complexity, like the tree of life effects, might be more vulnerable to disruptive effects of reduced genetic diversity. Once they were out of the garden and they couldn't fix those epigenetic errors, they would start to have aging. This is an article that was really the second, probably the third biggest nuclear bomb that came out. This is an interview mail of the authors of the article. Why I'm showing you this is that the authors spoke very frankly about what they thought their study meant. They weren't afraid of what others said, and came out with their back of their mind, even though they didn't put it in their article, their original article, but they said this is the implication of that article. The title says that all humans may be descended to people and a catastrophic event almost wiped out all species. That's not just humans, but all species 100,000 years ago, studies suggest. Well, what can you imagine would almost wipe out all human beings, all animals, and a pair of human beings that occurred in the distant past? So anyway, this study has prompted speculation that all modern humans could have descended from a solitary pair that lived 100,000 years ago. Scientists surveyed 5 million genetic barcodes. You remember those two libraries of barcodes of humans and 100,000 different animal species. And the results have prompted speculation that we sprang from a single pair of adults after a catastrophic event almost wiped out the human race and animals. I mean, so this is astounding. We don't just have a mitochondrial Eve and a Y chromosome atom, but we have mitochondrial animals and Y chromosome animals that occurred about 100,000 years ago by some catastrophe. Now the study, this is a reminder, the study did not identify the specific catastrophic event that almost wiped out everyone on Earth. This was the implication that these scientists gave the Daily Mail in their article. So they came on record and said that this happened, which is logical. So as the study shows, a bottleneck of 100,000 animals and mankind, but this defeats the long-standing lucky survivor hypothesis of 100,000 individuals, of 10,000 individuals. There were only two. So going back to the mitochondrial Eve, and when everyone said, oh, well, Eve was just a lucky survivor of 10,000 people. No, because we have just pairs in animals of 100,000 animals. This means it truly is just one pair of humans. Now I'm going to the Psalms for a second to explain that there's about 4 different passages in the Bible that explains that there was a global flood at one time. In Psalms 104, it says, he established the earth upon its foundations. And then he goes on to say, you covered it with the deep, the foundations with the deep, as with a garment. The waters were staying above the mountains. At your rebuke, they fled. You set a boundary that they might not pass over, so that they will not return to cover the earth. Now, young earth creationists and Answers in Genesis like to say that this is discussing Noah, but it can't be, because Noah was not talking about the same time of the foundations of the earth. So that can't be in this case. Here's another verse where God is talking to Job out of a whirlwind, and he gives him a science lesson, which is incredible. He says, when the morning stars sang together. Now, the morning stars, in my view, is the fallen angels. Is the angels. And excuse me. I was admitting somebody into the room. When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. So the angels are all happy. They're singing together. But what happens at this time? Or who enclosed the seas with doors when bursting forth it went out of the womb? You know, this is another reference to that foundation of the earth and the water being globally flooded. And at the same time, the sons of God were shouting for joy. This means that there's not been the fall yet of the angels. And I placed a boundary on it and set a bolted door. I said, thus far you shall not come, but no further. So again, we have this with Psalms 104 to show that there was a global flood. And at the global flood, so now this is a question I've also often asked to young earth creationists in a social media group. And I ask them, did the sons of God sing together at Noah's flood? Think about it. They didn't. They were attacking human beings and disrupting the genetics. They were fallen at this point. They were going against God's will and doing what they were doing. They were singing together at the global flood, but not at the local flood of Noah. Why did they do what they did in Genesis 6 that caused the Noah's flood? This is the very first prophecy given in the Bible, and it was God gave it to Satan. He said, and I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. This is basically a prophecy of Christ coming from Eve and her seed one day. And so Satan knows that mankind is going to come through the human line. So he wants to attack the human line, and there's no better way to do it than to genetically re-engineer it. And that's where we get to Genesis 6. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old. This is a passage in Revelation 9 where when halfway through the book of the tribulation, Satan and his angels are thrown to the earth. And it says a star from heaven, which had fallen to the earth, this is a fallen angel, was given a key to the bottomless pit. And he opened the bottomless pit, and then out of the smoke came out of it with locusts on the earth. And the power was given to them, as scorpions over the earth have power. They have as a king over them the angel of the abyss. His name was in Hebrew Abaddon, and in the Greek Apollyon or Apollos. So this is Apollos, which you've heard about in the Greek mythology. These angels were put in time out, presumably from what they did during the Genesis 6 corruption of mankind. And they were put in this, and they are being let out in the tribulation to do the last bit of harm that they're going to do. What's interesting is when you get to the sons of God, some people think, well, that's not really angels. But in the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Hebrew and is about 200, written 200 BC, the sons of God are translated as angels. So these Jewish writers knew full well, that these were angels. As well, the word Nephilim is the same word used in the Greek for titans, or half men, half gods in Greek mythology. So the Nephilim are the titans, and this explains Greek mythology. Now, this is an article that's influenced Reasons to Believe. It's written 23 years ago, and it says Calcaneus Dunes of the United Arab Emirates and Noah's Flood, the post-glacial reflooding of the Persian Gulf area. And basically, it says, we propose that the stories of a great flood recorded in the Bible as Noah's flood and the Babylonian history on clay tablets excavated in Tigris-Euphrates Delta as the Epic of Gilgamesh are a record of this rapid post-glacial reflooding of the floor of the Persian Gulf. The post-glacial rise in sea level rapidly reflooded the floor of the Persian Gulf because of the varying rates of sea level rise. These waters at times flooded across the flat floor of the Persian Gulf at more than a kilometer per year. Now, this would explain the flood, and I have to say I disagree a little bit with RTB because this is not fast enough, in my opinion, to cause Noah's flood. While this can contribute to it, to me it seems like there has to be some other flood going on at the same time. Because a kilometer a year, if that's all it was, then the people in the Persian Gulf could have just walked their way out of there. Now, why am I talking about the Persian Gulf? The Persian Gulf is where they believe the Garden of Eden is, and the antediluvian civilization would have lived in that area after Adam and Eve were put out of the garden. It was very lush. The Persian Gulf has 50% of the world's oil supply. You can imagine that for millions of years, it had the most lush vegetation anywhere in the world. So they were not going to leave that area. The gardening must have been phenomenal there. But again, at a kilometer per year, they could just simply walk out of that area. This article came out, which is really fascinating. These researchers were studying right at the tip of where that balloon is, where the balloon only tools tip. They studied that particular area, and all they could find were tools, but no bones. So why would civilizations that would have tools not have bones at the same time? And in the article it says the bodies are missing, but a prehistoric tools kit discovered in the United Arab Emirates has led some archaeologists to pose a more complex scenario to humanity's immigration out of Africa. In other words, they think that this area is maybe older than the out of Africa scenario, and that this is where where man came from, not out of Africa. First off, well, this is a kind of a silly way to show it, but on your left we have a shark having a nice, yummy leg bone. And then on the right, it says, I don't eat tools, silly. So if a sudden wave came over that area, say a tsunami, then the people would be killed, but the tools that were left behind would just kind of stir around and get into the dirt, and the sharks wouldn't eat them. So I think that might be an explanation of why there are why there are no bones, but only tools. Again, in that picture on the left, you can see the star which many theologians believe Eden is located because of the description of the rivers in Genesis 2. And then that whole area is the Persian Gulf, but in the past it was dry. So it's possible that's where Eden was, and that the antediluvian civilization was all around that area afterwards. Now I'm going to talk about the Toba catastrophe theory. It holds that this event caused a severe global volcanic winter of 6 to 10 years and contributed to a 1,000-year-long cooling episode, lending to a genetic bottleneck for humans. This theory was brought out when when the nuclear winter theory was real big. And they tried to attach it to the bottleneck of which they are aware of. I mean, we have this bottleneck which everyone was aware of, and they tried to tie it to Toba. Well, this part of the thing fell down, but they didn't think about the problems of the Toba eruption causing in the form of mega tsunamis. You see on the top left, the Toba supervolcano, which is in Sumatra. On the far right, you can see the bubble that shows where Sumatra is and where that thing went off. And it caused mega tsunamis all across the Indian Ocean that went across the tip of India and right up into the Persian Gulf area, or the dry Persian Gulf area. If you see on the bottom left, you see the Strait of Hormuz. You notice that it's got a bend to it. Normally, a tsunami, if it comes in, is going to just wipe everything out with a huge wave. But if you got a elbow bend into it, and it has to go over some land bridge like that, then it's going to smooth it out to where you'll get more of a surge of water than a massive wall of water. This is on the far left. This is a picture in a blog, actually. This is a excavation of the tip of India, and you can see the white ash area, and that's from the Toba eruption, the super eruption. They also found bones at the base of that eruption, and these guys really had it in for young Earth creationists because they said, "Wait a minute, you've got bones at the base." And the Toba eruption above it, and we know the Toba eruption had to have occurred well before 6,000 years, in fact, 70,000 years. So how can you explain this? So they were kind of poking the bear with this situation. But more interestingly, this validates the fact that the Toba eruption and its mega tsunamis, which would be a series of mega tsunamis, went right across India, and it slowed them down to some extent, so that the surge in water would have been gradual, and yet enough to take a boat 170 miles north. On the right, it says the human remains under the Indian ash remains from the Toba eruption. Genesis 8:22. Now, the Toba eruption theory was saying that it was going to have a nuclear winter of sorts, but God promises Noah that after the flood, time and harvest and cold and heat and summer and winter and day and night shall not cease. So this implies that he maintained the normal weather, so that you wouldn't have a nuclear winter from this eruption. This is an article at the Reasons to Believe site by Stephen Shua, and I've contacted him. We've chatted back and forth on LinkedIn. He's an astrologer. Excuse me. It's not an astrologer. He's an Earth observatory is his work, and he's in Singapore. And he wrote the article on the far right, said, could the Genesis have happened the way it was? And he basically inserts the possibility of mega tsunamis being involved with the flood, Noah's flood. It says, logical to assume that the flood should have occurred relatively near the river systems specified in Genesis 1 and 2. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, which reached heights of up to 47 meters, was generated by a magnitude 9 earthquake caused by rupture along the Sundra megathrust. Now, this Sundra megathrust goes right into Sumatra and can be involved with the Toba eruption. So basically what he's saying, that there probably were mega tsunamis involved with things. Now, if you've read Hugh's book on navigating Genesis, he doesn't discuss mega tsunamis being involved, except he criticizes the young Earth position that they say that there were mega tsunamis going on. And the reason being is they thought that this was a way to explain the geological Earth. With mega tsunamis everywhere, it would give you the Grand Canyon and things like that. So he was attacking that position, but he really didn't entertain the possibility of mega tsunamis coming from the south, which is from the Indian Ocean, because that would explain a northern movement of Noah's Ark. As you can see here, as you go from the Persian Gulf on the left, any mega tsunami or a series of mega tsunamis would go right up along the two rivers and would hit right against Ararat and deflect. So this might explain why it stopped at Ararat, because if you're riding on a big mega tsunami, it hits Ararat and then it pushes back and then it lets the boat down there. On the right, you can see that this is a topographical map showing that everything from the Persian Gulf and going up in green and blue is below sea level. So it also furthers the possibility of mega tsunamis going up in this area. In Genesis 7, it says the foundations of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of the sky were open. Now, to me, that sounds like earthquakes are going on and opening up rifts and such. And if that's going on, you're also getting mega tsunamis at the same time. This is the argument I was telling you about YEC, and they argued that mega tsunamis sculpted the whole Earth's geography. However, a worldwide flood with mega tsunamis would destroy the arc. So that doesn't make any sense, nor would it push it just north. It would get pushed left and right. If the mega tsunami came from the south, the Gulf of the Mon, you remember I was telling you that elbow, would convert it to large surges of water, raising the arc and pushing it northwards towards the right. Now, this is Japan when they had that huge earthquake that actually shifted the island by 8 feet. I mean, the whole island of Japan was shifted by 8 feet. It's interesting in Revelations when it talks about the most powerful earthquakes that ever occurred, it says the islands fled from them. You know, so that's an example of island fleeing because it's moving away. So when this mega tsunami hit, on the top left, what you see is a boat with a keel. And notice how it is twisting back and forth and being pushed because of the keel. In other words, you do better off without a keel in a mega tsunami. On the bottom left, what you have is a boat that is riding over the top of the tsunami out at ocean. And it's just kind of like a big wave, but it's not anything to disturb it. It just kind of rises up and goes over it. So obviously that's the situation you'd want for Noah's Ark, not to be like pushed around like in the top left. Now the right side, see that canister going along? Let's watch it go on in a second again. This canister has no keel or anything, and it's just flat on the bottom practically. And look how it just slides along, not being hurt by anything. So you want to be like that canister. You don't want to have a deep keel or rudder or anything else. You'd want to just pass right along with that canister, all nice and smooth. Here's 2 different arcs that have been made today. You have the top one in Kentucky with a big old keel in the front, and then over in Norway, and it has no keel. Excuse me. So basically, you want no rudder and a flat keel to do exactly what you see previously. If the findings are correct, this is going back to the study, then they have a significant impact on our understanding of human evolution. They would suggest that we are all much closely related than previously thought, and that we owe our existence to a single pair. Excuse me 1 second. Let the dog out.
Yeah.
Let the dog out.
Okay.
Sorry. My dog's about to beat me to death to get outside. Now, keep in mind, all mankind's mitochondria track back to Eve, but all Y chromosomes track back to Noah. Remember that Eve gives her mitochondria to everyone downstream of her, but only the Y chromosomes from one male goes downstream. But the bottleneck occurred at Noah, not necessarily Adam. So mitochondrial Eve is actually Eve, where Y chromosome Adam is actually Noah. Some studies show mitochondrial Eve is earlier than Y Adam, but this would be exactly what you would expect, wouldn't you? So highly conserved mitochondrial DNA is very similar across different species. This means that it's likely to be affected by mutations, which can make it a more reliable marker of species. So the researchers, Stockwell and Thaler's arguments have been met with some criticism, but they've also been widely accepted. Mitochondrial DNA is now widely used to study the evolution of species and is considered to be a valuable tool for defining species. These factors make mitochondria a reliable marker of species, and they are therefore a valuable tool for studying the evolution of life. It's interesting that in the journal article, in the news article, when they asked Thaler about his results, he said, "This conclusion is very surprising," Thaler admitted, "and I fought against it as hard as I could." So he was like the other researchers. They don't like the implication of this. So they don't like the fact that it points right to the Bible. This is their original article on the left. It's called "Why Should Mitochondria Define Species?" And on your right, you see this guy who's going through for a peer review article, and these people are going to beat him up as he goes down the road, the road, and then finally at the end you see a billboard that says "Paper Accepted." This is the sort of pushback and criticism you get. I'm going to show you exactly in this case what happened. After he published his study, after they published their study, they added about 90 days later in 2018, they said that this study is grounded in and strongly supports Darwinian evolution, which the study didn't say anything about Darwinian evolution. Auntie? So he had to bow his knee to Darwin.
Yeah, I have them.
In addition to, it says, including the understanding that all life has evolved from a common biological origin over billions of years. This work follows mainstream views of human evolution. We do not propose that there was a single Adam and Eve or propose that there's any catastrophe. Okay, so here they are. I've never seen this done. I've read thousands of articles, and I'll see an occasional errata published where they correct something that they said, but this is not an errata. This is a plain arm's been twisted. They're afraid of their funding. They went in there and added this to disavow what they had said to the Daily Mail and other news organizations. I mean, they came right out and said, we thought that there's this bottleneck has occurred 100,000 years ago, but they didn't use the word Adam and Eve, but they said that there's a single pair. But just even the implication of Adam and Eve by a single pair, the skies fell on these guys. So I remember this funny meme. It says, "I'm trying to follow the science, but it keeps leading me back to the money." And this is exactly what happens. If you don't say what your publishers want you to say, you can get cut off in a big way. So, in any event, if y'all are interested in these sort of subjects, this is a Facebook group that I have, Darwin versus Lamarck. And also I have two different blogs that you can follow. One's called Lamarckian Blogspot.com and Neo-Darwinian Review Blogspot.com. So that about does it. Let's take some questions.
Well, we're going to take a short break, and then we're going to have Q&A after that.
Okay.
All right. Juan, we're going to start the Q&A now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Everybody please sit down. Anybody have a question or take through that question?
That's the question is actually something about the seasons in that area.
Pardon me?
Something about the seasons like it says something in the Bible, there's a time to plant and a time to harvest. And you know, like if they have winter, summer, spring, and fall in the Garden of Eden, or was it somehow protected from that? Or maybe in that area of the world, it might have been neutral enough that there'd be minor changes.
Well, actually, I'm not sure. Well, the reason I found that verse was because of the Toba nuclear winter concept. And those researchers proposed that there was going to be bad weather for 1,000 years as a result of it. And then I found that verse in Genesis 8, where he basically said, I'm going to establish the seasons and keep them normal. And now I have no idea whether he was saying that in reference to the whatever the flood did, you know, but it seemed to be something he established after the flood. So it's complete speculation as what it might be. But there it is. While the earth remains, there'll be cold and heat in summer and winter, and the days and nights shall not cease. So this has to be a response to what the severity of the situation of the flood and all the rain and the tsunamis that were occurring. So whether this is by a special act of God or whether it's just a natural act of God, he was basically saying that things are going to come back to normal afterwards.
Yeah, that explains it. So what? Go ahead.
Does this imply that before the flood that there wasn't seasons?
Before that there wasn't season, you know, that's actually something that you can find in the Ferrari Study Bible, I believe, that they believe that there's a canopy over the earth and that, you know, that's why people were living so long. But not many people still believe that.
Yeah, it's more of a young Earth model.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't think that was the case. There's really no reason that the weather should have been different before and after the situation. And there's I've read articles that said that just can't be true. The water that's in the atmosphere is what's there. You can't add a ton of water and it sit around there for eons. It's going to come down.
But that verse does not imply that it hadn't been there before. It just says it will continue.
Oh, yeah. All right.
Yeah. I just found it an interesting verse and how it contrasted to the things that must have happened if the Toba eruption is what caused these things. And it seems like it has, because they found the ash layer of Toba in the tip of India and there were bones beneath it. So, which means there was civilization around before 70,000 years ago. And that just seems like that's another piece of the pie.
Yeah. So Vaughan, you mind if I ask the question? I have kind of three questions in one, okay? It's all with regards to the DNA. I'm not a geneticist, so I don't understand. Can you explain to me the difference between the human DNA versus animal DNA, and have they tested the giants, like the Nephilim, those huge, massive skeletons that are like 18 to 36 feet, and actually tested the DNA and seen, is there much difference? And what is the differences in the DNA exactly from a spectrum?
Well, number one, the mitochondria of human beings has the same number of base pairs as animals. It's about 1,600. So it's similar in number, and you can track it with these cytochrome oxidase barcodes. Now, the one about the giants, that's a fascinating question. I have no idea if they've actually found DNA in those things. I thought they were hoaxes myself. But what's your
I really don't know. Maybe someone in the group would have an understanding of it. But I have another question that ties to it. It's like, if God says that let us make man in our image and our likeness, then what is the essence of the difference between man versus animals? Because we know that the animals are made lesser than men, they're made soulish according to the Hebrew words for create, right? And also some of them are, and some of them are more even less than soulish. They're like reptiles or insects. So is there not some differentiation in the DNA from a biomolecular level that we
there is there well okay, for years people studied exonic DNA. That's the protein coding DNA. And if you compare chimpanzees and humans, we're 98% the same exonic DNA, but exonic DNA only makes up 2% of DNA. The rest of it's the quote junk DNA, and that's where the difference is really showing up. And there's been some studies recently showing that the junk DNA in humans is much different than chimpanzees, for instance, and they believe that it's why we have the increased capacity for thought and such. That's actually on my Darwin versus Lamarck webpage. If you if you went in there and typed in chimpanzee or chimp, that article would show up. I've got many articles on that very topic.
Okay, I'll check that. And on the same line, then there's in the different chronologically, you've got different men that have been discovered. Like you have the Precambrian man, you have the Neanderthal man. Have these men been tested for their DNA, and how is it spectrally correspond and compare to the original DNA from, say, Adam and Eve?
Well, I don't know about the mitochondria of them, okay, but it's my understanding that Cro-Magnon. I've seen different studies. Some studies say there's only 1 to 4% similarity with their DNA and ours. Then other studies say it's much more similar. One thing that actually does show up, and this is again the junk DNA, they last year the Spanish researcher Pablo something or other won a Nobel laureate based on his studying of the epigenetics of Neanderthal. He discovered that the Hox proteins, or the Hox genes, the ones that gives you the different size and arms and legs, etc., are very different between humans and Neanderthal. This also explains why their faces are much larger and their brows are much larger. But it also goes on to say that they have a much higher level of schizophrenia and mental illnesses. So if these organisms are people are relatives to humans, and there's only a small group of them up around England and Europe of about 50,000, they had a lot of problems physically. And they were kind of a splinter group, if anything.
Okay, thank you.
But from Buzz Rana's book about who was Adam, I think he showed that various studies confirm that there's a major difference between Neanderthal DNA and human DNA.
Yeah, like I said, I've seen some studies that say that we only share about 1 to 4% with them. But our bigger differences between our junk DNA. Our junk DNA differs vastly from theirs, at least 40% different. And that's also in that Darwin versus Lamarck. If you go in there and type in Neanderthal and epigenetics, you'll find that article.
Maybe you should confirm that with the audience that junk DNA is really a bad name, but it's actually not junk. It's actually functional.
That's true. Now, it's an interesting. Well, first off, junk DNA, the term came out by Ohno, OHNO, a Japanese geneticist, and this was back in '70. And then Francis Crick and Ogel jumped on the boat and wrote an article in Nature about selfish DNA, but he was also validating Richard Dawkins, who popularized junk DNA to some extent. Even though he didn't write a lot about it, he still popularized it. The biggest problem came along with Francis Collins, the head of NIH, who did the Human Genome Project, and he followed Darwinian theory to ignore 98% of human DNA, and it was a total disaster. It was a busted conclusion. So 10 years later, a group of researchers, and we're talking like 400 different labs with thousands of different researchers, called the ENCODE project. They typed out how much of the junk DNA and whether it was transcribing into RNA. And they found that 85% of it was transcribing into RNA, which implies that it must have some function. Well, they got a lot of pushback from everybody. They really didn't like it. And more importantly, they found out that 98% of genes are within 1,000 base pairs of junk DNA, which means it involves everything. There isn't a day goes by, I get a Gmail alert from Google Scholar daily from new findings of the intricacies of transposable elements, which is part of junk DNA. I like to actually keep using the word, and the reason I like to keep using it, I like to poke the bear at the people that came up with the term, because they're trying to convert it to non-coding DNA as a more sanctioned version. I said no, it's junk DNA. That's what you call it. Let's stay with it.
Are you pronouncing it JUNK, junk DNA, or was
Yeah, junk DNA. That's what they call it.
But it's actually not junk. It actually has function.
Well, it technically, the original term was junk DNA, but now they're calling it non-coding DNA, euphemistically. And that's because they're embarrassed by the fact that they dismiss 98% of the DNA. So I like to, when I debate with somebody, on the term in a social media paragraph, I like to use the term junk DNA, because that keeps throwing it back to the fact that they did it. So.
There's a question.
Well, along the same lines, it's not a question actually. Along the same lines, it was thought that tonsils and the other thing that was thought to be junk too, a leftover from evolution, and then later on was discovered that they did have a function.
That's a vestigial argument. And I've got an excellent background being in medicine to realize those things are very valuable, including the appendix, the tonsils, all those things which they said were, basically those are old failed Darwinian arguments that go way back. But the final argument really, instead of the vestigial organs, is the vestigial DNA called junk DNA, which was the biggest failure of neo-Darwinism, of any of them. It really is. Neo-Darwinism is a dead man walking. Everybody knows it. E.V. Koonin, who has 250,000 citations from scientists, he said, let's not mince word. The modern synthesis is dead. That's incredible for people to say things like that. And it's just, there's so many things that neo-Darwinism doesn't take into account. The junk DNA, the horizontal transfer of transposons, epigenetics, niche theory, developmental plasticity, phenotypic plasticity, just a number of things which cannot be explained by happy mutations and natural selection. Furthermore, last year I wrote an article for RTB. There was an article published in Nature where they used CRISPR technology to induce mutations in synonymous codons. Neo-Darwinism had proposed since the beginning of the redundant genetic code that synonymous codons were neutral, evolutionary. In fact, the neutral theory of evolution was built upon this thing. However, they realized that 75% of synonymous codons were actually deleterious, which blows up 60 years of genetic studies. The way we calculate natural selection is by what's called a Ka over Ks ratio, or non-synonymous over synonymous mutations. And they did all these thousands of articles. I mean, over 30,000 articles saying there's positive selection because we measured the DNA. They're all wrong. Over 30,000 articles saying natural selection was occurring are wrong. So, I mean, and this was done because of CRISPR. So it's really not even, it really neo-Darwinism is on its way out. Everyone realizes at this point. I would say that at least 50% of biologists realize it's gone. The other are worried that it's not gone. So,
all right. Was there somebody had a question here? Okay.
So I just wanted you to clarify a couple of things. The topic is whether all of our humanity came from one pair of individuals, Adam and Eve. So I just want to go back to two things that you said. I think I understand. You implied in the beginning of your lecture that Adam and Eve were placed on Earth at two different times, maybe several tens of thousands of years apart. And you make the suggestion that Eve came first. Which two things that run through my mind is that sort of contradicts what's written in Genesis, that Adam came first, number one, and number two, if Eve came first and Adam did not come until like 20 or 30,000 years later, then does that imply that there's no procreation for 20? She was alone on the planet for
yeah. Let me jump in there real quick, because I didn't imply that that's the truth of it. I implied that that's what the science was showing, which I disagreed with, actually. And I'm sorry that I didn't explain that well enough.
Part of my confusion is that I heard like 10 or 12 different theories that you gave us from different articles with regard to how Noah's flood came about. But I didn't hear from you whether you had an idea which theory was correct, right? So the second thing that runs through my mind is what you said about Noah's flood. You said that you thought that at the time of Noah's flood, prior to that, everybody was living 900 plus years, and after Noah's flood, their lifespan was reduced to 120 years. And you make the suggestion that it was because of some special potion that was from the tree of life that they were no longer able to access. But and you brought up epigenetics. We had a lecture last year about epigenetics, where they have epigenetics being changes in the base pairs over a period of, I would say, multiple generations of procreation. So are you saying that some special potion from the tree of life was discontinued? How does that connect with the fact that you have flooding of most of the earth? Would it not be instead maybe some changes in the ozone layer that created more radiation that would have changed our genetics that would limit our lifespan? I'm trying to figure out what you think is the cause for the changes in our lifespan from 900 years to 120 years. You suggested it was some special potion on the tree of life, but how does that
answer? Let the guy answer.
Oh, sorry.
Well, yeah, that's a large question. To answer the first question, I pointed out that Nature Journal said that mitochondrial Eve lived at 200,000 years, and then when Y-chromosome Adam was discovered in the research, they placed him around 70,000 years. But I don't think that's biblical. They just basically said that that's what they thought, and they kind of laughed it up that they had never met each other. And then I showed an article again from Nature that said, hey, wait a minute, there's two major studies here that show that they lived about the same time, around 100,000 years ago. So that's what's unfolding in the science. That's not what I'm saying, or I'm just kind of showing you what they say. But I do think that the one that says, hey, they lived about the same time is more biblical. Now, as far as the age dropping off, I showed the different antediluvianization folks, Adam down to Noah, and that they lived about 900, all were living about 900 years. And then after the flood, I showed you a curve that was almost perfectly met that goes down to 120 to 80 years. And I'll admit that I don't know what's caused that. I would say that I believe that the reason that's occurred is because of the bottlenecking that occurred at Noah, at the time of Noah. And he did not have the tree of life like Adam and Eve did to prolong their life. Now, I believe that the tree of life prolonged their lives possibly through epigenetic mechanisms, through rejuvenation. And it didn't, I don't believe it changed them genetically, but epigenetically, and it preserved their life. So when they didn't have access to it, they started to age and die. But it didn't really change mankind for a long time, even down to Noah, it wasn't changing. However, after the bottleneck that occurred of the population from Noah on, his kids having kids, there were certain factors that occurred after that. And I would suggest it's the loss of the pre-epigenetic variety and also the lack of genetic variety that occurred. And when I say genetic variety, say you've got a garden full of flowers with all different colors. If only two of those plants will mate with one another, they lose genetic variety. They become more homozygous. And the same thing would have happened in the case of Noah's family. It's been noted in founder populations like salmon up in Alaska, when they start things from tube, that their epigenetics change and that they age more. And I
lost the connection.
Can't hear you. We cannot hear you.
And he's not even moving, so it means
There he is.
Sorry, we didn't hear the last part there.
Well, I think that I made a proposal that this is related to epigenetics. I didn't really go far enough to say this is exactly how, because I don't know. I am saying, though, that there's been 9,000 articles on epigenetics and aging in the last 5 to 10 years. And as you can imagine, some pharmaceutical company is going to want to figure this out. And I talked to one researcher last year who said he believes in the next 10 years, we're all going to be living 140 years of age. Yeah. So that's astounding.
Well, there are other theories on why the lifespan went down. Hugh Ross proposed that there was a supernova about the same time as the flood, and the radiation from that caused the reduced lifespan.
That's correct, and I've read that. Although that would come from the mutation model of radiation causing mutations to lengthen lifespan. So, that's also hard to prove. I'm sure it would cause more cancers, but both Hugh and I are shooting in the dark right now. we both have our guesses.
So one theory, I just want to mention, one thought I had is that God says that a man's lifespan is 120 years. And to propose that men will live beyond that, is that going against what God is saying? And do we know in history, other than like prior or after the flood, have men lived longer than 120 years? I think it was one Japanese man that lived 120 or 119 years.
No, but if you go back to Genesis 6, he says his life will be 120 years, but that 120 years is not that his life expectancy is that. It's that in 120 years, the flood is going to hit. You see what I'm saying? So it's not like he suddenly limited his that would imply that everybody died before the flood at 120 years.
No, I don't mean that. I mean, there's another passage in scripture that says that a man's life, his span is 120 years. Like almost like God has ordained it. That's the maximum that live.
No, but as I would point out though, that all these guys were living 900 plus years, not 120 years. And the 120 years is in fact him warning man that, in fact, what he says is, my spirit will only strive with man for 120 years. That means the Holy Spirit's going to try to convict this antediluvian civilization to get on the boat or to be saved. And so I believe that the 120 years there is not that his life expectancy is 120 years. I mean, it is indirectly. It means that in 120 years, the flood's going to occur.
Okay, so you interpret it as being part of the flood in 120 years. There's no appreciation for 120 years, didn't he?
Chris, you have a question?
Yeah, you mentioned that you thought, or people think that Eden was in sort of the middle of the Persian Gulf. To me, it seems like that's, maybe a couple 100 feet under the water level today. What's the explanation for that? Was the Persian Gulf dry?
Correct. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I didn't explain that. Yeah, it's widely known that the Persian Gulf was dry at least 20,000 years ago and maybe earlier. They don't know exactly when it flooded or filled up, but it was definitely dry. They do know that.
How deep is it? How deep?
You're right. I think the deepest is 200 feet. But what's interesting is if you go to the Fertile Crescent, which is up in Iraq, it's also about 50 feet deep below sea level. So you could just imagine a wave going right up through there, up through the Fertile Crescent. And what would stop a boat going up northern being pushed by a big wave, but a wall of a hill, their Ararat range. Otherwise, he would slam right into the hill and break up. But if you had a big tsunami up against the wave first, and the boat is trailing the tsunami, then that would cause a backflow of water, which then would push the boat and stop it right flat on the ground.
What caused the water to be so low? Was it like in the glacial age? Did the sea level?
Part of it is that, yes, that is part of it. And that's also why that RTB has that agrees with that one study that the icebergs came down there and tunneled down through there.
Yeah, that's the theory, that all the land around it was covered in ice, so that the weight of that pushed that part down, which forced the Persian Gulf to go higher, like a teeter-totter.
Yeah,
I see.
It kept down and shifting. It's constantly changing.
Okay.
Does anybody online have any questions? No? Anybody else in the room here have any questions?
I got one of that. I don't know how related it is to this, but a question I often get asked is why the animals that Australia has are limited to Australia. Why, we only can be in certain places, and Australia, of course, is especially different.
It's an island. It's an island.
What's that?
It's an island. It's surrounded by.
Yeah, but so God made animals specifically for Australia and nowhere else. Like,
I think there was a bridge to Australia somewhere along the way. I'm not totally sure, but you notice that the study that these guys came up with of the 100,000 animals, they said 9 out of 10 animals and humans went extinct at the same time. So this would imply that at least 10% of the larger animals were at other areas, including places like Australia or the penguins, etc., Americas. So, I mean, it's a fascinating idea that the animals and humans would be extinct at the same time almost.
I have a question. Going back again to the timing of Y-chromosomal Y-chromosomal Adam and mitochondrial Eve. You were talking about the issue that they were separated in time and everybody was laughing about it. But then later on in your talk, you mentioned that Y-chromosomal Adam is actually not Adam, but Noah. So that he would have happened later in time than Eve.
Correct.
So is the scientific data kind of going towards that, or is it still more like they're right on top of each other?
Well, that's a very good question. The error bars on determining how old how old these species are difficult. I mean, they can be plus or minus 100,000 years. So there were some studies that were showing mitochondrial Eve as being tens of thousands of years older than Adam, but that would have actually, you know, made all this concur. Reasons to believe was, I believe, we're dealing with the earlier studies showing Eve as being way older than Adam, and they were using that argument, and then that article comes out that says they're at the same time, so they pretty much dropped the argument because they didn't need to use it anymore, if that makes sense. But even if let me find this. Okay, yeah, this is that Nature Journal article that I put up there. It says studies show that Adam and Eve same time, and
That it again? Where is it?
Yeah.
and not get 100 citations. I mean, that people are pissed off and they're not citing the study at all. but it's nevertheless, you know, in the literature, and they have to deal with it.
Do you think that when they say they're at the same time, are there years apart, or they're at the same time? Did God create them at the same time? Because
Well, this study really God, obviously, and when they say they're the same, about the same time, we're talking about plus or minus 10,000 years at least.
so Eve was alone for 10,000 years. You're suggesting?
No, no,
You don't have the accuracy to get back that far.
no, the scientists were trying to play that game. They were trying to play the game like the BBC. Adam never met Eve. They were all yucking it up, you know, for years, actually, for 10 years. There's all these studies saying, they never met each other. So, and then that came out and they're like, oh, dang, nobody cited them.
So Juan, and to our brother's question here, do you think as we develop more technologies and nanotechnologies, other say the quantum technologies, that we'll be able to figure out and zero in more accurately to start like the sort of Adam and Eve in terms of knowing more about like when they were born, exactly, or when they were created?
Well, that's an excellent question. And now that CRISPR's out, we made some things like that. For instance, when they make the genetic barcodes of mitochondria, they use enzymes that go in there and cut the DNA, etc. Right? Perfect fidelity almost. So if they start running these things using CRISPR, they could really get the dates much more accurately.
Yeah, I had another question. I'm sorry, like to ask this question, but I want to understand this regarding aliens and like the Nephilim and the giants and the sons of God. If and I understand you may not, what I want to ask you is, what would you expect to see at a genetic level that would be different from human and animal DNA, that's alien DNA, like, or from the giants? What would you expect to see different?
Well, if the fallen angels, it depends. Angels have the ability to take the total form of a human being. You recall the Lord when he presented to Abraham and was going to go to Sodom and Gomorrah, that the two angels in human form went into Sodom and Gomorrah. So they can completely whip up a whole set of DNA and intestinal tract and everything. So it's no big deal for them to indwell or inbreed with women. How they did it, it's anybody's guess. I would imagine they did it through influencing the epigenetics to make muscle tissue larger and bone tissue larger, etc. And that way they wouldn't even affect the genes. They would change how the genes are expressed. Have you noticed a bee and the queen bee, or an ant and the queen ant, how different they look? Well, they're genetically identical, but it's the epigenetics that makes one like the other. So, in using that same sort of fashion, they can take what's called phenotypic plasticity, which is not a part of neo-Darwinism. It's part of the new evolution called the EES. And they can change the phenotype on an individual right away. So I think that's pretty much how it happened. I don't think that they changed their DNA sequence.
Well, in that sense, can you explain what is the epigenetic difference then between animals versus humans versus, say, Nephilim? I don't understand. How would you understand that or explain that?
Okay, if I have a diagram somewhere in an article that I wrote, and it shows a human and a chimp, and it shows a platypus, and it shows a fly, and all these other things, and it gives different percentages of the same DNA, and they're all remarkably the same. We're all close to about 80% the same. Everybody, all animals and humans. It's the epigenes that make them different. It's the way the epigenetics plays those genes that makes us completely different. So now it's an interesting thing. Have you ever read the book or you remember the movie Chariots of the God by Von Däniken?
Yeah.
He was the guy that in the 50s he was all about UFOs as a kid, and he was at a Catholic convent school in Northern Europe, and the church had frescoes of the Nephilim, and the sons of God interacting with women. And when he saw it, he said, "Holy cow, that's aliens from outer space doing that." And if you've ever watched a History Channel show where they have these jokingly guys called ufologists, you know, with the weird hair or whatever, I mean, you know what it takes to get a ufology degree? About $89. I'm not kidding. And all these guys track back to Von Däniken. And it really makes sense because it's a real possibility that the same thing that happened during the times of Noah is going to happen in the future time of the tribulation. Yeah. Not having women or children, but angels interacting with the DNA to cause them to have magical, abilities. But and also, my own personal favorite is that maybe a big, huge mothership will. I don't know if y'all believe pre-trib revelation. I'm a rapturist, so I believe that we're going to rapture, and then right after that, there's going to be some explanation in the heavens to explain all this, and which will be aliens in my view.
Yes. Okay, one final question.
Well, no, I want to.
Oh, yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, two more questions.
What might be quick? One of the terms that I think was Fuzz Rana or he Ross used was that God didn't have to reinvent the wheel. So there's a similarity in structure and similarity in genes and that sort of thing that we all breathe the same air, we all are under the influence of the same gravity, etc. So a lot of things could be the same. And then there's those minor things that make big differences between one animal and another, or humans.
Well, what's interesting is we tend to think in Mendelian terms, like our parents begat us and we begat children and grandchildren, and that inheritance is vertical. Inheritance is only in a small way vertical. The larger part of it's horizontal. When you go back way back to the very beginning of things in phylogenetics, life moves around. Do you realize that you have 4 in your body, have 400 trillion bacteria in your body? You have 1,000 bacteria genes for every unique human gene. So we are completely interwound into what's called the microbiome, and it's all around us. It's part of us, and it moves through us. And to think just simply in Mendelian terms is that's one of the big failures of neo-Darwinism, and that's why we need to move to a new evolutionary that's moving all around and doing things. I mean, they've discovered a bacterial transposon that occurred 5 million years ago, and yet forming the syncytial layer of the human placenta. How could it just shows you that, and we call this theory pre-assembly, that there was these pre-assembled parts that, even though they occurred a long time ago, are now being used today. And So it's quite remarkable, really. It just it amplifies the magnificence of God's plan. It's just amazing.
Go ahead.
You know, there seem to be all kinds of unanswered questions today, and you indicated that in some research there were thousands and thousands of papers written, and that they were all found to be wrong. Will AI in the future help us to sort out a lot of these questions and make help us to answer some of these questions in the future? Sure.
I was skeptical of AI until I used it, and I used Google Bard. I've written 400 blogs in my blog sites that I showed to y'all, and I used Google AI to write them. It's amazing what you can do with it. What is amazing is, okay, so over the last 7 years, I've been reading hundreds and hundreds, probably 3,000 journal articles on epigenetics. And only rarely would I get a nice blurb that was poking the eye of neo-Darwinism, because everybody was afraid to say anything bad about the old grand man, you know. However, I can pull up an article, a research article, and I get the most updated articles daily in my email. And I can see the fact that a particular topic challenges neo-Darwinism. The author will not say that. However, I can have Google Bard summarize that article in 800 words, and then I could say, give me 400 words on how this article challenges neo-Darwinism, and it does. It spells it out completely. It's remarkable. So, you know, what this is going to do is it's helped me. My understanding of biology has helped me tremendously. Now, I had to understand it before I could use it, because it can slip things in there that are wrong. But if you know what you're talking about and read a lot, it can really. And you know, I'd be happy to even give y'all a tutoring on it, because it's really amazing.
Thank you.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay, we're gonna end the meeting now, and we'll see everyone again next month. Thank you, Vaughan, for all your work.
Thanks very much, Vaughan. It's great.
An updated Michigan 17, Washington 3. So, we'll see you next time.
All right,
Thanks so much. Thanks for being here.